focus today is maximizing your Rundeck migration. I'm going to try and translate that because sometimes we use phrases that we think everybody is really familiar with, and it's not always clear what we mean. In this context, we're talking about how to migrate from Rundeck's community version to our enterprise version. And there's actually a lot of data here that we could cover. We're still going to cover a lot of data, but not everything because it wouldn't fit in the time we have. So I'm going to try and cover a lot today. We will also follow up within the next week or so with a link to a blog article that'll go into a more thorough list of the steps that you'd go through. But I'm going to try to cover the most important pieces, at least conceptually today, as we go through our slide deck. And time permitting and otherwise permitting, we'll also look at a few of the pieces live in the interface. I'm not sure the demo piece is going to be that exciting in this case, but we will try to do that before we're done if we can. So we'll go ahead and launch into things. From an agenda perspective, I'm going to start with a few questions that I think are worth you asking before you get started. There's a few decision points. There's a few things that you have a chance to review. So we'll discuss what those questions might be, or at least the ones that occur to me. Which migration approach is best for you? There's essentially two approaches. We'll talk about those and kind of the pros and cons of those. Some steps to prepare for the migration. Key steps during the install and upgrade process. Handling project migration, which is specific to one of the migration approaches, and then shared cluster resources. And lastly, a few other considerations. Though we are talking about the migration from community to enterprise, the approaches we're talking about here are, generally speaking, the same approaches you take if you were upgrading from one Rundeck version to another. So in the future, depending on how much of a change maybe there is in the product or other things in your environment, you might consider these same items. So while this is most relevant if you're moving from the community version, I think there are topics here that are worth considering even if you're already an enterprise customer, depending on the nature of some of the things you've got coming up. So there's questions. First, do you want to change the way you've architected your projects or access control? Because you're going through a change of some kind here, from your old server environment to a new server environment, this is your chance to maybe make those changes without it disrupting the work that you're doing. And if you are going to make a change like this, that probably helps you decide which approach you're going to take to the migration. So in general, how your projects are architected or stored is essentially the same as in enterprise as it is in the community version, but you have a chance to kind of rethink that piece now if you're making this migration. Do you want to have settings for Rundeck projects and the like in the database or on the file system? This is a question that is worth considering. Based on the way that I'm going to describe you to do the migration, you're probably going to end up with settings in a database. That is effectively the default method for most things today. But if you have an older version of the community version, or even for that matter, if you had an older version of Rundeck Enterprise, originally many of these items were on the file system. There still are a few things that can be on the file system, but many, if not most settings have been moved to the database in order to make it easier for those settings to be propagated across all of the servers in your cluster environment. So just worth thinking about. If there is a reason why you want to keep these things on the file system, you need to make that decision ahead of some of these other steps and perhaps change a little bit accordingly. You can always force it into the file-based mode rather than the database mode for most of these settings, but you need to be conscious of that as a setting. In terms of migration, do you prefer an upgrade that is faster or one that is safer? I would argue, as I look at the migration options, and we'll talk a bit more about the essential differences in these migrations, both are relatively fast and relatively safe, but the two paths to take, one I would consider to be a little bit faster, and the other is a little bit more cautious / safer. So if you can answer that question for yourself, that will imply which path to take. at least at a high level. I did get a question in the Q&A that we can answer quickly, although it's a complicated answer. I think I can give at least the basic answer. The question was, what is the difference between the community and enterprise versions? And essentially, community version is how we refer to our open source version that anybody can get for free. The enterprise version is our paid version. It's a more complicated answer than that because there are feature differences, but hopefully that clarification addresses what you're looking for, at least for the moment. We do have articles on our site and other videos that talk about the enterprise versions. So if you need more information on that, we can point you to those to answer it. We've done other webinars on that topic. So which migration approach is right for you? The two approaches, as I said, are the faster upgrade, which effectively is an in-place upgrade. It's taking the same server that you have today, removing the community version, replacing it with the enterprise version kind of over the top. You reuse your database, you reuse your server, and for that reason, it's a bit faster. Because you're using your existing database, it already has your keys in the key storage, but it is harder to roll back, and if something goes wrong, you're taking your system offline. The safer upgrade path, or what I refer to as the safer upgrade path, means you're going to install Rundeck cleanly on a new server, and typically also start with a clean database. You can still bring over settings from your old server, but the safer upgrade option allows you to handle the migration separately from your existing installation. And so your users can continue to use Rundeck in the community version as long as you need them to, and you really only turn the old system off when you're ready and live with the new system. So that's why it's safer in that sense. Even if you were to go live and then realize there was something that hadn't gone the way you expected, you could always turn the new system off and go back to the old system because they're independent of one another. Because you're doing a new install, it allows you to change project structure, ACL structure, other sorts of settings much more easily than if you go with the quote unquote faster upgrade method. The cons of the safer upgrade is there's more preparation. It's going to take longer, mostly because it involves exporting and importing at least some of your projects, and you're going to need to reset your keys and secrets, so passwords and SSH keys. Both, neither method is going to take terribly long, relatively speaking, especially if you know what the steps are, as we're going to cover them today. But when I've talked to customers in the past, and this is a conversation I've had directly with a number of customers who are more interested in just getting the process done with, therefore faster, tend to go with the first option. Those who are more conscious of not having outages will tend to go with the second option. There are a few things you can do that are kind of hybrid between the two, but essentially those are the two approaches to take. So if you are someone who, for your own reasons or for reasons of policy, need to be as cautious as possible, then the second option is going to be the thing. If you just want to get to the new version as quick as possible, then the first might be closer to what you need. So in terms of the migration and preparing for it, you need to have some things handy that will help you with this process. And these are probably more important in some cases for the safer upgrade, but most of these are true either way. You need to know that you've got access to your keys and passwords that you'll need for connecting to your Rundeck nodes. You'll want to have credentials for your authentication system. So if you're using LDAP or Active Directory, a user and password you can use to search that database to find other users, especially if that's something you haven't done in your community version. Make sure you have that handy. You'll need to set up shared locations for your execution logs and potentially other resource files like node resource files. Optionally, although this is fairly common, you'll want to set up a load balancer in front of the cluster servers. Rundeck has high availability functions that will balance the workload in terms of the jobs being run, the work being done, but Rundeck doesn't consciously try to balance users interacting with the system. So the load balancer will do that for you, where a user coming to the system will be directed to one or another of the members in your cluster. And then if you're using any custom plugins in your community version, you want to make sure you've got all those settings handy as well, because you'll want to set those up on the other system. You also want to make some backups of your database just to be safe. Whichever method you're going to go, you want to know that you've got a backup in case something happens during the process, you accidentally delete something you didn't mean to. You also have that data to go back to either on your original server or on an alternate server, whatever. You probably want to just make a backup of all your Rundeck files, your Rundeck directory, but the key ones are framework.properties, rundeckconfig.properties, and your node resource files. Also your ACL policies if your ACLs are on the file system, which they might or might not be depending on how old your community installation is. These days, by default, as I mentioned earlier, many settings, including policy files, would actually get stored in the database as part of your system. But initially, back in the day, those files were always on the file system. So you may have a couple of default policies on your file system, but your other ones could very well be in the database, in which case you don't necessarily need to worry about backing those up. Those will come with some of the other backups you're doing. And then if you are concerned about maintaining all the history of jobs from your old system to the new system, you also want to make a backup of the local execution log files. This is a bit of a tricky piece because if you keep all of your history, if you're going with the safer upgrade option, keeping the log history on a per project basis is going to make the migration take a lot longer, because when you export your project, if you include the log history, it makes it considerably larger depending on how many logs there are. So best practice, if you just want to be efficient and can afford to let go of your history, is actually to do an export without those logs, or to delete the logs before you do your backup, your export of your project. So if it's something that's important to you, you can do it. Just bear in mind that depending on the approach you're taking, the execution history is going to slow you down. It's just the nature of it. There's a lot of data there. The way the data gets stored, some of it's in the file system, some of it's in the database. And so you'll want to make sure you've taken a backup of the files to the database, and you'll drop them into an appropriate location in your new instance, new installation of Rundeck. In terms of preparation for the safer upgrade, you probably want to delete your job history, although this is optional. This is more important if your community version is Rundeck 2.x. If you're on Rundeck 3, the job history, you have an option to choose not to export it when you export your projects. But on Rundeck 2, that option didn't exist. And so you need to delete job history ahead of time in order to make sure that that extra baggage of the job history doesn't go with the project when you export it. And in order to do that, you'll need to probably use the command line interface to do that. Then whether you've deleted job history or not, you're going to need to export your projects, ideally without the job history, to make it a smaller file and a faster file to export, and more importantly, a faster file to import. That's really where you'll see the slowdown mostly, if you're going to see it. You'll want to copy those backup files we were just talking about from the old instance into a staging directory on the new server. You don't want to drop them directly into the structure where your new files are going to be, but you want them to be available to you so that you can compare them to your new files when you've started your installation of the new server. Lastly, provision a new database. In most cases, best practice would be that that database is not on the same system as your Rundeck server, although it could be. But remember that with Rundeck Enterprise, you're typically running a cluster where there are 2 or more member servers, and all those servers will be talking to the same database. So it gets a little confusing if the database is on one of those servers, to make sure that all the servers are connecting to it in the same way and all of that. So ideally, keep the database on its own server. You could, even in the safer upgrade option, potentially use your database from your original community version, drop it into your new database server, and then upgrade over the top of it. If there's reasons why you need to do it, you can pursue that route. I personally would refrain from that, because if you can get a clean database and a clean install, it's just, there's less things that can go wrong, and it puts you in an easier spot to be able to make changes to what you have in place as you do this migration. There was a question about the job history piece that I was just talking about. Is it all or nothing? Can you select the history for some jobs to keep it and for some not? The answer, unfortunately, is yes and no. I will clarify. If you are on Rundeck 2, you have to delete the job history, and I think you're going to do that sort of for all jobs. When it comes to exporting, you will be exporting on a per project basis. So if you're on Rundeck 3, you're exporting per project and can choose for a certain project whether you want to keep the history or not. So it will work the way you're looking for in terms of this question if you're on Rundeck 3's community version. But if you're on Rundeck 2, that's less clear because you can't choose per project whether to export the history or not. You just don't have that option. So you're deleting the history and then you either have it or don't when you do the export. So hopefully that's clear, but I think it'll do what you want as long as you're Rundeck 3. So one option might be to upgrade from Rundeck 2 to Rundeck 3 to give yourself a little bit more capability, but obviously anytime you do an upgrade that introduces some risk, so you may not want to do it just for that reason, but that would be one way to work around that problem if you needed a bit more granularity. Good question, thank you. Okay, and then for the faster upgrade, after you've done the backup steps that we just did a few minutes ago, you're going to want to uninstall the open source version. You don't really want to end up in a situation where you have two different versions installed, although technically you could. So take your backups, either back up the whole file tree that's got Rundeck in it, or back up the specific files that I just mentioned, the open source community version of Rundeck, and then you're kind of ready to proceed, move into the installation and configuration steps we're just about to talk about. So first thing is going to be install Rundeck. Ideally, install latest version of Rundeck. That changes periodically. We're on 3.2.6, something like that. So grab the latest version from download.rundeck.com and install that. You need to, before you do much else, if you're connecting to an external database, which you should be in production, then you want to enter the database connection settings in Rundeck config.properties. By default, it will be pointing to the development database called H2, which is kind of internal to the system. You don't want to be using that in production, so you want to be pointing to your MySQL or Postgres or whatever the database is. If you're doing the faster upgrade option, then you can just copy those database connection settings from your old Rundeck config.property that you backed up. Otherwise, you're entering new settings. But essentially, those settings are, what's the path to that server, including the port and credentials, if those are needed to make that. Then you need to take a look at the two important config files that we use, Rundeck config.properties and framework.properties. Take a look for anything that's in your old files that's not in the new files, and probably paste those into the new files. The reason we want to take this approach is these new files, when you install a fresh install, will potentially, likely have some properties in them that your old files didn't have. And we want those new things to all be included. But there are some things that you've already established in your community version that you want to take with you. So you want to copy those things over as well. I don't know of an easy way to automate this piece, but chances are there's not a huge amount of things that you're going to bring over. But just take a look, compare side by side the comparable files and just look for anything that's in the old that isn't in the new and bring those over. If you're not sure what they do, you should be able to do a search on our documentation site to find the property and what it does if you need to confirm that it's something you want to take with you. And then, as I kind of alluded to earlier, you have several things that could be stored in the database or could be stored on the file system to be safe, especially if you've gone the faster upgrade path where potentially there were settings already on the system. You want to make sure, ideally, that your key storage and project data are stored in the database. And the reason for this is when you get to the point of installing your second server, which we're not going to talk about too much today, but when you add your second or additional servers beyond the first one, if the information that we're talking about here is stored in the database, they'll just automatically have that information. If instead they're stored on the file system, then you'll need to copy them to the proper locations on every server as you build it out, which is too manual It's a frail process and obviously could break down. If there's reasons you need to do that, certainly there's ways to address it, but ideally put as much as you can in the database. Lastly, a piece that you wouldn't have ever done in the community version is you want to get the UUID from the framework.properties file. So when you do a fresh installation on the server, one of the things that will happen is it will add a line that has something called a UUID in it. It's just a long alphanumeric string. We need to get that string to our support team so we can get you a license key. You can do an install without having that key, but you're not going to be able to start to actually run jobs from this new server until you get your license key. So that's an important step in here if you're going to be able to proceed. Okay, so project migration. The project migration step is something that you will only really do in the safer migration or safer upgrade approach. If you do the in-place upgrade, you're using your existing database, and chances are the project data is already in the database, so you don't need to do this. But if you've done a new clean system, you're going to import any of the projects you want from your old system to the new system. You do have a choice here. You don't have to import everything, and I think this is worth, again, emphasizing. You can leave stuff behind if there are projects you created that never get used or that need to be rethought before you bring them into play. But for the projects that you do want to migrate, you need to create a project first with the same name as the comparable project on your old server, and then import that archive file for that project. When you import the project, it's going to associate with that same project name, and everything should get updated. Do remember that among the things that are in that project file are references to keys or secrets or passwords. If you have such references, you need to make sure that the keys and secrets you add to this new system are in the same place, meaning following the same path as they were in your community version, if you want everything to kind of work straight out of the box. Otherwise, you'll need to amend those. You'll need to fix the project settings or the job references or whatever that have that. You're just going to repeat that process for each project on the new server until you've added all the projects you intend to. And that's going to put them in the database. And consequently, any new servers you bring up will automatically have those projects there and all the associated information that you need. If your projects, one or more of them, include resource definition files, meaning files on the file system, which typically might be a resources.xml file or a resources.yaml file, but could be named anything. You're going to need to recreate those files as resources for each project, and you're going to need to put them somewhere. Ideally, you're going to put them in a shared location that all your servers can get to using the same path reference. That could be in a Samba share or NFS, or could be in an S3 bucket. I don't know. There's many ways you could do that, but you are going to need to recreate those files, and you want to do it in a way that will work the same for all your servers rather than having to recreate that on every server. So this is almost the end of my slides, and I just want to re-emphasize that when you're moving from community to enterprise, you're almost always moving from a single server environment to a clustered server environment. That's usually the reason that you've gone from community to enterprise. But there are some things then that have to be different and handled differently in your cluster than in a single server. And I'm trying to point out some of those here based on the most common mistakes I've seen people have during this migration process. So one of those, maybe the most important that gets overlooked, is database encryption. When you do a fresh install on your new server or a fresh install on your old server, depending on which of these options you took, that first server is going to auto-generate encryption settings to connect to the database. So it's going to connect to the database automatically. You don't have to do anything special, and that connection is going to be encrypted. If you were to install on a second system and connect to that same database, it's also going to generate encryption settings, but there'll be different encryption settings. So on the second, third, fourth, however many other servers you have in that cluster, you'll need to copy the settings, the encryption settings to connect to the database from server one to the other servers in the properties file. If you don't do that, what you'll find is that those other servers initially are able to connect, and then they lose their connection because they're not using the same encryption settings. So this isn't a hard thing, but it's easily overlooked. So just something to keep in mind. Not a problem on your first server, but when you get to your second server, you need to keep this in mind. You need some shared locations that are accessible for all cluster members for at least one thing, which is job execution logs, and also probably for node resource files or other files that you might need to reference in jobs or otherwise. So any resources that all the servers need to access in the same way, you want to set up a shared location that you can put those things in. So I think of these as two different but comparable directories, if you want to look at it that way. One that will have all your job execution logs in it. That could be done a number of ways, as I just said. I think most commonly I see people do it with something like an Amazon S3 bucket or the comparable thing in Azure. But you could do it with MinIO to kind of mimic S3, or you could do it with an NFS share. Probably going S3, Azure, or MinIO would be recommended in that those already have a method of handling kind of high availability of that data. But however you want to do it, every server needs to be able to reference that information in the same way and not have it be local to them directly. Optionally, a similar directory that has your resource files or other files that you're going to reference would be a good idea as well. I've just found that almost everybody has something that they need to handle other than the execution logs that they need to share across those servers. So thinking about that ahead of time and establishing a location for that is a good best practice. And then there's high availability settings. And we have a whole other webinar we've done on this, so I'm not going to go into detail. But the two sets of policies you'll want to look at are auto takeover policies, which handle scheduled jobs, and remote execution policies that handle non-scheduled jobs, meaning I choose to run a job right now. How should those jobs get handled? Which server in my cluster should run those jobs? So those are both worth taking a look at. All right, couple last considerations. You still need to configure your authentication. I told you early on you needed to have that information, but you want to set that up. It might be the same as what you did in community, in which case that's going to be pretty easy. You'll copy it over. Chances are you don't have to change anything. But here's your chance to maybe move from local authentication to LDAP or AD or maybe Okta, depending on what your enterprise is doing. Couple of optional things, although often these are done by most customers. Adding SSL certificates, where you put them, whether they're at the load balancer or on the individual cluster members or both, is up to you, but it's at least worth thinking about. Do you want to have SSL and get that enabled? There's also a source control management plugin that lets you version jobs. Worth looking at setting that up if you haven't already. You do want to set that load balancer up probably to be in front of your cluster and to be able to distribute users who are coming in to access the system. And then lastly, on a per project basis, you can set settings that will automatically delete jobs older than a certain time period. So this is not an option you would necessarily have had in community, depending on how old your community version is, but it's worth kind of addressing this right up front for each of your projects, setting, do you want 30 days of history, 90 days of history, 5 days of history? I don't know. The shorter you can keep that window, the fewer logs you're holding on to, the less database space and file space is going to get used for those, and potentially that's going to make things a bit more responsive. Initially, you're not going to see much difference, but over time it does make a difference, so addressing this early on is just good best practice.